Second of our three candidates for our Chief Water Scientist position. And today we have Brent Newman. Brent is from Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he's worked over 2 decades as a hydrologist there. He's also worked for the last 4 years for the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna as a isotope hydrologist. And so he's got a background with a PhD at New Mexico Tech, and has done a lot of work on isotopes and groundwater hydrology, and has also a pretty broad view of water science and water management. So it should be a very interesting seminar. And without any further ado, Brent Newman.
Thank you, Neil. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here to talk to you today, and really enjoyed the interaction so far, and I think I'll go ahead and get into the talk. So the outline of my presentation is what I'll do first is talk about sustainability of water resources, and I'll start off kind of locally and then really talk more globally about water resources issues. What's the sort of current status, current situation and concern. Then I'll go into a more technical discussion about isotope hydrology. And I just want to give you a few examples of the kind of work that I've been involved with, and how these techniques are really relevant to groundwater, surface water problems. And then, as requested, I want to finish just with a few slides on vision for the Water Resources Institute, the chief scientist position. So this is a map of drought severity in Texas from January of this year. And you can see there's a lot of hot colors here. You've all lived through this drought. But and I'm sure you know a lot more about it than I do. But I looked at the Texas State Comptroller's report, and there's some really interesting things that came out of their highlights. 23 water districts were within 180 days of running completely out of water. You have agricultural losses of almost $9 billion. Texas groundwater supply is expected to fall by 30% by 2060. And then you have 16% approximately of total power generation currently vulnerable to unavailability of cooling water. So when we think about water resources, it's not just about how much drinking water you might have, but there are strong connections with water and agricultural production, and also energy production. So water scarcity related to drought or overuse is a big deal at sort of these more local scales, but even globally. So I'm going to step back now and really expand out to the global scale. We know Earth is a water planet. 70% of the Earth is covered by water. But when we actually look at the kind of water we have, we know that only about 2.5% of the Earth's water is fresh. And most of that is locked up in glaciers and ice sheets. And much of the remainder is in groundwater. But, well, what this means is that less than 1% of the water on Earth is fresh and currently accessible for use. So that's not much. The other aspect that we have to always worry about is that globally water supplies are unequally distributed with respect to populations. There are very water-rich areas with low populations, places in Asia with extremely high populations that have very little water, and this has important ramifications for how we use, manage, transfer water. Water scarcity is a really huge issue, not just in Texas, as I'm sure you're aware of. Over the last century, world population has tripled, but water use has increased by sixfold. Some impacts, and this is not comprehensive, but half of all the wetlands globally have disappeared. We have a situation like 20% of freshwater fish are endangered, and the predictions are that by 2050, between 1.7 and 7 billion people will face water scarcity issues. And these shortages will not be felt uniformly because, as I mentioned, water isn't distributed uniformly either. So if we look at global water use, approximately 50% of the accessible water is being accessed by mankind. However, by 2025, it's expected to rise to 70%, and by 2050, not that long away, 90%. So the little water we do have is going to be very quickly fully allocated in a global sense. So the water scarcity issue is certainly an internationally recognized problem. The UN has been very concerned with this. As Neil mentioned, I worked at IAEA. It is a UN agency. And the UN has development goals, Millennium Development Goals. And one of them is to have, by 2015, the proportion of people without sustainable access to proper drinking water. So we're talking about millions and millions of people who do not have access to decent drinking water supplies. This program's been going on for a while, and in 2010 there was a pretty extensive review that was done, and there has been significant progress because of the help of UN, NGOs, other agencies. More people do have access to reliable drinking water supplies. However, the progress has been very uneven, and in some large regions, for example in Asia, many areas still, the people have, less than 60% of the people have access to a decent drinking water supply. And in fact, it's quite clear now that this goal of having by 2015 the amount of people without access is probably not going to be met. There's also an increasing concern that improvements in water quality have not kept up with improved water access. So I'm talking a lot about water scarcity today, but I don't want to give you the idea that water quality is not important as well. I'm going to talk quite a bit about groundwater. Groundwater provides 50 to 90% of freshwater supplies in many areas. However, the assessment and management of groundwater really remain a challenge in many countries because aquifer or groundwater reservoir characterizations are generally incomplete. So people don't know a lot about groundwater because you can't see it. And so historically, groundwater has been managed in quite a different way than surface water. In the future, there's going to be an increased need to use groundwater. Population growth is a huge driver of this increased need for groundwater, and I'll explore that a little more in my talk. But also, climate change scenarios suggest that because surface water supplies are going to be less reliable, that groundwater is going to be needed to be tapped even more to make up that deficit. So this is what's known as the water box from the UN World Water Development Report. And it shows the features, elements, and processes involving water resources, including links to food production and energy. So I know this is a great deal of interest here at Texas A&M. And so I'm not going to go into detail about all the things that are listed in this box, but I want to point out that the box is complex because all of these interactions and feedbacks are very complex. So if we start here and list different kinds of water resources, rainwater, groundwater, lakes, reservoirs, and so on, we can manage these, and this will affect water uses, you know, domestic supplies, agriculture, industry, energy, and so on. These things impact life and livelihoods, economic, security, employment, and you have business and economic actors, political actors, civil society actors that are all modifying feedback or creating feedbacks through this entire system. So these actors create pressures related to finance, exploitation, pollution, and so forth. So one of the challenges that we have in dealing with the water resources and the sustainability of water resources is that we can't just independently do hydrology anymore. That we have to understand the links and the feedbacks between water supplies, energy, agricultural production, ecosystem impacts. All of these things need to be brought together. So I'll give you a quick example of a connection between agriculture, energy, and water. So if we look in India and the Punjab, they grow rice and wheat. And this is a groundwater-based irrigation. So the farmers are pumping the groundwater faster than the groundwater is being resupplied. And so what happens is the water levels in the ground are dropping, and what they do is increase pumping. They have a pretty fragile, overtaxed electricity grid, and this increased need for energy stresses the electricity grid even further. What's interesting is that the farmers pay nothing for electricity, so they just keep pumping and pumping, which places additional stresses on the water table and on the electrical system. So overall, irrigation accounts for about 15 to 20% of India's total electricity use. So this is a pretty big thing. And the government recognizes that all these issues are interconnected, but planning and actual practice, there's a disconnect there. But this is, I think, a pretty interesting example of the interconnections between energy, agriculture, and water. This is an interesting thing that I got from Pasquale Studito and FAO. This is FAO's projection of, based on the projected population increases, how much more food do we need? They're estimating by 2050, food production needs to increase by 70%, or even 100% in least developed countries. We need an increase of about 7% in irrigated area and an increase in 10 to 14% of water withdrawal. And they're actually assuming some technological advances where water use efficiency for agriculture is actually improves. With these kinds of need to increase food production, this is a big impact on water. So these kinds of projections are actually quite dire and really serve as quite strong motivation, I think, to be looking at water resources in an integrated way. this is also interesting. We were concerned a lot about transboundary water, surface water or groundwater that crosses political boundaries. They could be countries or counties. And we're making a lot of transfers of water from one area to the other. But even when we're dealing with agricultural products like grains, when we ship grain from North America, say, to Asia, this is actually also a transfer of water. And so agriculture is, in effect, a sort of virtual water currency. So we can value agricultural products as well as energy. Instead of in dollars, you can actually write these or consider them in terms of amount of water needed. And you can see that this is a plot again from FAO. To generate 1,000 kilowatts of electricity, you need so many thousand gallons for gas, steam, combined cycle energy, oil, coal and oil fired power plants, even more, 20 to 50,000. And then nuclear uses a lot of water. So I think these examples should convince you that there are really important links between agriculture, energy, and water that we need to deal with, on top of the just general water scarcity issues that the world is facing. So when we look at some water resources aspects of agricultural land use and energy, there are really two questions from the water side that are fundamental. How much water do you have, and how long will it last? Oftentimes, we don't have good answers for these. And there's some associated questions. Where does the water come from? Where is it going, and how long does it take to get there? And you know, these are very almost trite questions, simple questions, but there are really big gaps in our knowledge. We don't do a good job in answering these questions right now. And so what I'm going to do next is just talk a little bit about isotope techniques as one way, not the only way, but one way of trying to deal with these kinds of questions. And so I have some simple examples, I think, of the kind of information that isotope techniques provide. And if we think about basic hydrology or hydrogeology, you can merge these techniques with hydrogeochemistry and isotopes to come up with good solutions to understanding water problems. So why do we worry about isotope techniques? To many people, these are very exotic kinds of things. Well, they really allow you to get a rapid understanding of the hydrologic system that may otherwise require years or decades of monitoring. So a small sampling of stable isotopes, carbon-14, might give you as much or more information than 20, 30 years of water level measurements. In some cases, you can provide unique information that you just can't get otherwise. And I'll talk about that when I talk about groundwater age dating in a little bit. And especially nowadays, isotope techniques are really cost effective. The analytical costs and the difficulties of doing isotope work has really become much easier, and the costs have gone down. So when we talk about isotope hydrology or isotope geoscience, we're talking about stable and radioactive isotopes as tracers or fingerprints of the source and movement of water, climatic conditions, geochemical and or hydrological processes. We can look at things like groundwater ages, basin residence times of water, very applicable to contamination problems in surface waters and groundwaters, and also more and more they're being used to look at ecological and biogeochemical processes. And when I talk about the isotopes, There is an aspect where, especially back in the 60s and 70s, that people would use an applied tracer with a particular isotope, pour it on the ground, and watch where the water moved. But what I'm talking about here are really more environmental tracers. These are tracers that exist everywhere now that you can just go and sample. So we're not talking about actually adding anything to the water. These isotope techniques are looking at things that are already there. So I'll back up and go over a few sort of fundamentals. What is an isotope? So this is a sort of different version of the periodic table or chart of the nuclides. And we see, for example, something like hydrogen that we're all familiar with because of H2O, for example. And we see that hydrogen actually has 3 different isotopes. There's hydrogen 1, sort of the plain vanilla hydrogen that we have in all of our chemistry textbooks. But if you add a neutron to the hydrogen atom, you get deuterium. And if you add another neutron, you get tritium. The green and the white boxes are stable isotopes. That means they don't change with time. And they may change with process, but these things are not radioactive, whereas when you get to sort of an unstable state, you do get into radioactive isotopes like tritium or carbon-14, which probably many of you are familiar with from archaeology and so forth. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit about stable isotopes now. They don't change with time. They change as a result of process, like phase changes. So this is the picture of the global water cycle, where we have evaporation from the oceans, vapor transport over the continents, it rains, and then eventually through river flow, groundwater flow, it returns to the ocean. And these numbers represent the oxygen 18 values of the water through time, or through the cycle. So an ocean would have a value of about 0 per mil. When it evaporates, things change, and when you get over the continents, precipitation values are about -10 per mil. And don't worry too much about the numbers, but the idea is things like evaporation, recondensation, and precipitation have big effects on isotope values, and we can use that to our advantage. So in hydrology and also ecology, we use isotope ratios. These aren't concentrations like a chemical concentration, and what we're talking about is just the ratio is the abundance of the rare isotope over the abundance of the common isotope. So if we look at water and we look at oxygen isotopes in water, when we talk about the stable isotopes, we are looking at the ratio of oxygen 18 of water molecules with an oxygen 18 versus water molecules with an oxygen 16. But we use these funny delta values as our unit, and we don't use the actual ratio. And a delta value is just equal to this ratio of the rare to common isotope in your sample minus the ratio of the rare to common isotope in your standard divided by the ratio in the standard times 1,000. So this is the equation for hydrogen with deuterium and hydrogen 1. And so you get things like this. The hydrogen stable isotope composition of -10 per mil means there are 10 parts per thousand less deuteriums in your sample than in the standard. So don't be alarmed when you see negative numbers. All it means is that this ratio is bigger than this one. So if you don't understand the equation right now, don't worry too much about it. But I wanted to at least give you an idea of what the delta value is. One of the things that is useful about stable isotopes, and I'm going to be talking about hydrogen and oxygen, actually looking at the isotopes of the water molecule, is that the isotope composition is strongly temperature dependent. And this really helps us out. So this is the oxygen 18 value of global precipitation from the IAEA Global Network of Isotopes and Precipitation database. And you see there's a very strong correlation between mean annual air temperature and the isotope composition of rain and snowfall. This really helps us because it creates unique fingerprints of different kinds of waters. So you can tell the difference between a water here versus a water here. And so I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. This is a map of the global average annual oxygen 18 in precipitation. This is something that we've worked on at IAEA. And I am showing this just to give you an idea that there's a lot of variation in these isotope values over the globe. And so this helps us understand where water comes from, which is a very important part of understanding hydrologic systems. In fact, what's interesting is if we plot oxygen 18 versus deuterium for precipitation, we get quite a strong linear trend. And this is a very helpful thing that helps us tease out important hydrological information. So if it rains here tomorrow and we measured the oxygen 18 and the deuterium, it's going to plot somewhere along this linear trend. And this can help us understand seasonality of precipitation and the relationship to groundwater. So for example, now as we're heading into summer, if it rains, we would get values that plot on this part of the line, whereas in the winter, when it's colder, we'll get values down here. So throughout the year, precipitation just moves up and down on this fairly well-constrained linear trend. Let's see, yeah. So if we sample, say, a groundwater, we can understand which types of precipitation events are actually contributing to recharge of the groundwater system. Another interesting thing that we can do with the isotopes is look at the elevation or the altitude of recharge. So this is a plot of delta 18O here versus altitude for an area in Argentina in the Andes. And there's a real clear trend where you have more negative isotope compositions with higher altitude. This is partly a temperature effect. But this trend exists in many places around the world. And we can exploit that to get some pretty useful information. So if we take this trend, fit a linear regression through these precipitation data, we have a model for predicting where groundwater recharge is occurring. And so this is the model here from the Andes, and these circles are different springs and precipitation samples. So the blue circles are springs. And what's useful is we can take a sample of the spring and we would want to know, where does this water come from? It may not come from something very locally. It might be coming from a place that's many miles away, a totally different part of the basin. And we would want to know this. So if we measure a value here, say at I guess this would be about minus 7.7 per mil oxygen, and go up to our elevation model, our line, and come across, we can see that the altitude is, what is that, about 1,200 meters above sea level. So this is a really simple but useful way of figuring out where water is coming from. And in fact, many places, I was working in Morocco, they're using this technique to establish groundwater protection zones for the many karst springs that they have in the Atlas Mountains. So this is, again, a very simple approach to know where you want to protect a recharge area. The other thing that happens when you, with water, is when it evaporates, you have a change from liquid water to water vapor. And what happens is that the remaining water, as you evaporate it, it moves off this line along a slope something like this. And so when you plot oxygen 18 versus deuterium, you can really see, have these waters been evaporated, what's the extent of evaporation, and it's another way of helping sort out what can be happening in a system. So one of the questions, this is a study that was done in Australia where they sampled groundwaters, and they all plotted here. Well, they're not on this precipitation line, so you don't know which events were really contributing to the groundwater recharge. However, by plotting an evaporation line through the data, you can look at this intersection and find out that it looks like events that are around 150 to 200 millimeters per month are the big ones that are contributing groundwater recharge. So this is a semi-arid area, and it turns out that if you just looked at, say, an annual precipitation rate, it's not that insightful in terms of how much groundwater recharge you have. What's really controlling the amount of recharge is how many big precipitation events that you have. This is another example using these plots to look at mixing, which is another benefit for using these kinds of environmental tracers. So the black circles and black squares are groundwater samples from an urban aquifer in Caracas, Venezuela. And the red dots are water samples from the local water treatment plant. And then the blue dots are surface water isotope values. And what you see is that, by and large, all of the groundwater data plot in between these two end members. And so these groundwaters are actually mixtures of surface water recharge from creeks and rivers and infiltration of water from the water treatment plants. So again, a simple set of data with just two isotopes, and we can really learn a lot about how even urban systems behave. Now I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about age dating with isotope tracers. This is really another powerful aspect of isotope hydrology. We want to know how old the water is because we want to know how long it takes for water to get from point A to point B in the ground. And so we have a variety of different isotopes that we can use that give us quantitative age or residence time information from virtually days to millions of years. So I've worked a lot in Africa while I was at IAEA, and I think this is a nice example of explaining how useful the radioisotopes can be. This is a plot here of the oxygen 18 of deep groundwater in northern Africa. This is a plot of current day precipitation. And without really worrying about the numbers too much, you can see that the colors and the patterns are really quite different. So if present day precipitation was a big contributor to these aquifers, you would think they would look pretty similar, but they don't. So the question is there some kind of climate change signal in these water systems? And if we look at tritium, we see a pattern that looks like this. And I need to explain briefly a little bit about tritium. Tritium naturally occurs in the atmosphere, so this is hydrogen-3, it's radioactive, has a pretty short half-life of just a few years. But in the 1960s especially, when countries like the US, Russia were doing atmospheric nuclear tests, it released tritium globally. And so we can use this, what's known as bomb pulse tritium, as a hydrologic tracer. And what's neat about it is if you see bomb pulse tritium, you know that water is 50 years or less old. So it's a really nice, powerful tracer. And when we look at tritium in these Northern Africa groundwaters, what we see is a lot of blue, very low, little to no tritium, which is suggesting that these waters are probably older than 50 years or so. But how old might they be? Well, if we look at carbon-14, things get very interesting. So in carbon-14, we're looking at percent modern carbon. So we have in the atmosphere right now, we have carbon-14s produced by cosmogenic interactions in the atmosphere. It has a fairly, not totally, but fairly steady rate. When you bury carbon the carbon gets removed from biological cycling, the carbon-14 starts to decay. And this is the principle of dating a bone, say at an archaeological site, is when something dies, the carbon-14 in that bone will start decreasing. Well, we can use this in water. We can measure the carbon in water, measure how much carbon-14 there is. If there's lots of carbon-14, it's probably a young modern water. If there's low carbon-14, it's old. And knowing the half-life of carbon-14, we can do this in a quantitative way. And what we see in Northern Africa is a lot of hot colors. So the oranges and yellows are very low percent modern carbon, less than 20%. There's a few places that have some modern water, but these are giant aquifer systems that are, when you actually do the calculations, these waters are in excess of 10,000 years old. So these are fossil groundwater systems. They're huge. There's great exploitation potential, but these aquifer systems are like oil. When you pull the water out of the ground, that's it. It's gone forever. There's not much renewal of this groundwater system. So knowing this kind of information can really help water managers manage their water more appropriately. You have to treat waters like these in a much different way than, say, water in some parts of Texas where it might be only 50 years old. Now one of the interesting things about some of these red areas is that it has no carbon-14. So it's even older than the sort of limit of carbon-14 dating. So I'm going to look at the Nubian aquifer here, which is kind of the circled area, and look at some other isotope tracers that we can use. So we can use Krypton 81, and when we look at that Nubian aquifer system, these groundwaters range from 200,000 to 1 million years old. So this is quite an interesting thing. I think a lot of people have no idea how old groundwater systems can be. So we have a range of dynamics for groundwater recharge where you have aquifers that are recharged, every year or have very short residence times to aquifers like this that they haven't seen much water in, you know, a long, long time. And this isn't the only example in the world where you can get million-year-old water. There are also examples in Australia and elsewhere. So I want to kind of wrap up the isotope examples now. I think I mentioned earlier these 3 key groundwater questions. Where does the water come from? Where is it going? How long does it take to get there? And I think the examples I provided kind of show how we can get at this kind of information. And these answers are absolutely critical for building reliable conceptual models of how water resources behave, and also for computer modeling of water resource use. So the last part of my talk here, I want to talk a little bit about the vision for the Chief Water Scientist position and the Institute. I think it's pretty clear that the ultimate goal is to be a recognized leader in interdisciplinary water resources research, and to become a key state and national asset for addressing complex environmental, agricultural, and energy production problems that involve water resources. And we really do need to have an interdisciplinary agenda because the critical water problems of our time require solutions that traditional discipline-bound approaches just aren't going to provide. So how do we get there? I think there are sort of 2 main routes, supporting state, national, and international agencies through applied projects, and projects that are relevant to water management and policy-making decisions. This is a good thing because you can demonstrate direct and tangible benefits to society through applied research. And it also often requires some interdisciplinary considerations. In other words, we can't just look at the hydrologic residence times. We have to factor in other things such as economics, ecology, energy production demands, and so on. The second sort of tier would be building strong interdisciplinary programs related to water sustainability more at the national scale. This is an area where we would want to integrate more basic research studies, more developmental kinds of things. And to do this, it really requires integrated cross-disciplinary teams. And because we want to tackle difficult or complex problems where new approaches and technologies need to be developed, it's really paramount that these teams are truly integrated. I think one path, although it's not an exclusive one, is to pursue observatory-based science. This is really a big trend in the ecological world. Hydrology is trying to go there. There have been some issues there, but certainly this is where a lot of the advanced research is going. These observatories are really a good way to collect interdisciplinary information in a coordinated way because the observatories themselves, their missions nowadays are to look broadly across various scientific engineering disciplines and even bring in the societal aspects as well. But this is a tough thing in terms of just even generally building interdisciplinary teams. It's a real challenge to build high-functioning teams. It's fairly easy to grab an engineer, grab a geophysicist, grab an ecologist and an economist and a geochemist, stick them together and say, okay, submit a proposal. But that's not exactly what I mean by high functioning teams. That's not really a true integration. And the reasons for this is, one reason is that disciplinary jargon and philosophical differences need to be overcome. I've built interdisciplinary teams. This is a real problem. It can be overcome, but it really takes some concerted effort. And it really takes time to build teams that have adequate levels of trust and to establish clear and coordinated research goals. So an expectation that this can be done quickly and easily is really not a realistic one. This is kind of a learn by doing situation where, but if you have strong leadership and a commitment by the team, you can make some successful conclusions. So when I started working in eco-hydrology, we did an AGU Chapman conference where we invited the ecologists and hydrologists sit down together, and we forced the scientists that attended, that were working on a series of papers, to actually work together on the manuscripts. And not that we didn't allow the ecologists to go write their paper and the hydrologists to go write their paper. This was a tough thing. People had a hard time with it. But most people stuck with it, and in the end we got some really interesting papers out of it. And I think it's an example that these kinds of challenges can be overcome, and you can come up with some very interesting and useful interdisciplinary outcomes. So I want to acknowledge a few people here. Pradeep Agarwal, Luis Zaragoza at IAEA, Mark Howells, who was at IAEA and now is at University of Stockholm, Pasquale Studito at FAO, and Chuck Young at the Stockholm Water Institute. I've worked with these people and borrowed quite a few slides from them, so I want to make sure I give them credit. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions, answers, or questions, and we can you can expound upon some things, or we can just have a general discussion about things outside the realm of your presentation. But questions on Dr. Newman's presentation?
I noticed that a lot of the work that you've conducted in the past has been primarily at a global scale, and I know that this is just a picture of all that you've done. A lot of the water issues in the state of Texas are local. They're the irrigator with 20,000 acres of rice off the Colorado, for instance. How does some of the efforts that you've done previously here tie into more of a local scale type of policy and management approach?
Okay. Well, I did, you've got it exactly right. I did focus a lot on the global thing. Part of that is just my recent work at IAEA. Previously, though, a lot of the things that I did while at Los Alamos that I didn't discuss at all were of this kind of scale. Generally, these were more contaminant issues, but similar problems, local scale contamination problems, and looking at flow, transport, and the risks from those contaminants. So a lot of the tools that I talk about and the approaches that we've used can cross scales. So some of the approaches are very applicable to smaller scale studies. I will say there are certain things that just aren't going to work at smaller scales, like the altitude gradient thing. If you have a flat field and no gradient, that technique's not going to be very applicable. But there are other approaches. The other thing is you can always, you have very sophisticated flow models nowadays where you can look at pumping scenarios and the works. There are also other kinds of investigations in the field that one can take that give you very good, high resolution, sort of more point or small scale information about percolation rates and so forth. So I think one of the things that's important nowadays really is to make sure, or at a big institution, is to have tools that work across different scales or a variety of scales. So maybe one tool doesn't work so well at one scale, but you've got a different tool in your toolbox that you can pull out. So you know, this integration of traditional hydrologic measurements, environmental tracers, modeling, geophysics, as an example, is something that you can tailor to address the specific problem that you're interested in. Yes?
I'm excited to hear you talking about stable isotopes. That's something that I've been working on as of late with Jason West. We have actually a TWRI funded project using stable isotopes to ask questions about the water source for invasive riparian plants and whether or not that's that water is being drawn directly from the Rio Grande. And we've got some really interesting findings. And you know, one of the things that we'd like to see happen with this is use this information to maybe go after some more funds to make this more maybe generally applicable SF-type fund. You mentioned observatories, and so that kind of ties into my question, which is about your strategy, both from the standpoint of team building and looking for funding sources. So are you thinking along the lines of the critical zone observatory, in which case you organize a group of people to go for that type of funding?
Well,
More about your funding thoughts.
Sure, okay. Well, first, it's interesting hearing about your work with Jason, and you know, this is another example of, you know, where does the water come from that becomes important. And the critical zone observatory option, I think, is something that I would really want to pursue. I really like the idea of the critical zone observatories. For those of you who are not familiar with this, it's a program where I think there are, what, 4 or 5 of these right now across the U.S. There's one in Pennsylvania in the Shale Hills. There's one actually it splits between Arizona and New Mexico, sort of semi-arid, and then there's one in the high Sierras that really is focused on snow. But the critical zone is more or less the soil zone, although not strictly, where you have a lot of critical biogeochemical, hydrologic, ecologic processes and interactions going on. And so these programs were specifically set up to be transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and there's a lot of really good research happening at the CZOs, and there are definitely good collaborative opportunities at the existing CZOs. I don't know whether there's going to be an opportunity to build new CZOs under that program. It might be a little late, but I think there's still a push to do more observatory type work, and so, you know, Ari and I were talking that maybe if the stars align, Quasi will get observatory science going. That would be something that we would really want to, I think, would go after. And you know, there have been criticism of the initial work in Quasi is just go out, collect a bunch of hydrologic data. And I think the push now is really to be a more multidisciplinary approach, bring in large scale, like basin scale analyses, but also bring in, you know, the societal aspects of the whole water resource issue. You know, the economics, land use decisions, these kinds of things all need to be factored in, along with the fact that most of our water basins are so strongly anthropogenically impacted through urbanization, agriculture, and so on, that this has to be considered as a fundamental part of the system now, not these isolated, pristine river systems and groundwater systems. So, yeah, I think there are actually quite a few different avenues where a large multidisciplinary team could work. I think right now, you know, keeping an eye on the observatory aspect is maybe one of the better options, but you know, there are going to be other things in the future that a large team could you know, try and go after some significant funding. You know, NSF now has this new, was it Clever initiative, where you have to have endorsements from 2 different program managers in NSF to sort of force NSF, probably more than the researchers, to be a little more integrated. Yes?
Last year, Texas had a terrible drought. This year, we've gotten some rain in the eastern part of the state, but still the western part, west of I-35, hasn't gotten the rains that we got here. The city of San Angelo is running out of water. There's over 100,000 people who live in San Angelo itself. There's a lot of small communities that also get their water from the reservoir out there. And they're in pretty dire straits. If you were the chief water scientist, what types of initiatives would you put together to try to address their short-term problem of running out of water pretty quickly, and maybe the longer-term issue of water supply?
Mm-hmm. Well, short-term, that's a tough thing. I think one of the things that could be done is, at least the limited experience I have in West Texas, I have some colleagues that have been doing a lot of groundwater development in Midland, Odessa area, because their surface water supplies are disappeared. So as what I was alluding to in my talk, I mean, the recourse you have short term is to go after groundwater. And it may not even be your groundwater, it might be some kind of a transfer from some other area. I mean, you have limited options, but what can be offered is, you know, better models of, say, the groundwater system or the interactions between the surface waters and the groundwaters, so that short-term decision making, you can put wells in better places, not only for production aspects, but just from minimizing impacts to neighbors, this kind of thing. So that would certainly be one area. But I think the bigger area of growth in terms of the research would be the long term. These kinds of extreme dynamics over time is not something that traditionally hydrologists have really thought about that much or tried to deal with. And the long-term implications of this kind of behavior is something that needs to be explored. And as I've mentioned previously during my discussions here, our tools aren't very good right now. And so there's some real developmental needs on the research side that can be done to reduce uncertainties and make our models and approaches a lot more useful for dealing with tough problems like that.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up. Just want to remind everybody that we do have opportunity at 1:30 for research extension.